I'm just going to start by acknowledging that we're on Wiradjuri country, and with that, any past, present and emerging elders that we have with us today. So Paul Newton is a Sydney-based portrait painter noted for his ability to capture a likeness and sensibility. Newton has twice been a finalist in the Moran Portrait Prize and has twice won first place at the Portrait Society of America's International Portrait Competition. He's also spoken at the annual conference for the Portrait Society of America. He has 32 commissioned paintings at the Domus Australia Chapel in Rome. He's a 15-time Archie finalist, and his portrait of comedians John Doyle and Greig were in HD, won the Packers Prize and the People's Choice Award in 2001. And here he is to talk about his experience.
You'll have to excuse me, I'm getting over a cold, so my voice is a little bit dodgy. I hope you'll bear with that. So, just to give you a little bit of background, I thought I'd talk about the painting of Royal HG, but just also about my work as an artist and how that came about. So my training began in the 1980s at Julian Ashton's Art School. You can see the facade there. This is George Street in Sydney. And then I went on from there, and here's a few other photos of Ashton's. You get the sense of what the place is like. And when I was talking to a friend of mine one time over a couple of glasses of wine, and I tried various things, didn't really know what to do. And he said, you should come to art school. He said, there's lots of a great social life, lots of pretty girls, and you can learn to draw and paint. So of course I was free to sign up there and then. And then at the same time, I was studying at Julian Ashton's. I also was studying with a guy called Graham Hinson, and Graham was a protege of Max Meldrum. This was the first painting. It's only about 8 by 10, it's very small, and it was a Beethoven gift mask. And he had these black and white, essentially grey little studios, and he would set up still lifes and he would start just painting in black and white. Because in doing so, you would look at the tonal values. Tonal values means like the grayscale, from black to white, and all the variations of grey in between that. So colour was removed from the equation and you were focusing on tonal values. Which when you're learning to paint, like any of these paintings, any representational works, colour is the most obvious thing, and the drawing or the outline is probably the next most obvious. But tonal values are often missed. So this is a way of really focusing on that. This is me many years ago. This was what my parents described as my bohemian period. I was working as a musician and worked then after that as an illustrator in the advertising industry. This is after I'd been at Ashton's for several years, and these are some of the illustrations that I did, the debasing of my art skills. I was freelancing, so I was working for everybody. Everybody and anybody. Just to hide Yeah. So I get an art director. In fact, this guy here was is an art director. And he told me, Paul, I want you to paint a picture of a guy, and he modeled for me in this particular scenario. So I then went ahead, photographed him, and then designed the composition based on that. So it's obviously very cheesy and a long way from what I'm doing these days. This was a kind of a Norman Rockwell take, if you remember Norman Rockwell. And I got my dad to pose as actually the body is of Dick Ashton from Julian Ashton's, and the face is my dad and some other kids that were family friends. So after, sorry, this microphone keeps going off. Two. While I was at Ashton's, and even when I started working in the advertising industry, I was always keen on portraiture. And I was spurred on in large part by my and my fellow art students' addiction to the oldest and some would say the most controversial portrait prize in the world, and that's the Archibald. So for years I entered unsuccessfully. I'd submit the work and I'd get it back and be disappointed and think, well, back then I'm not going to win it out again. And then 12 months would elapse and I'd reconsider and I'd think, okay, I'll have another go. So anyway, eventually they did hand one. And this was the John Doyle's Sydney radio presenter back in the day. And it got the Packers Prize. In fact, Steve Peters, who was the chief packer, came up to me in the throng at the media announcement of the winner of the Archibald. And I knew Steve from entering all those years. He tapped me on the shoulder and said, "Paul, great news." I said, "Yeah." He said, "You won the packing room prize." I said, "Great. What's that?" I had no idea. This was long before it was ever a big thing. But it was obviously a great honour to think that, people, the average man on the street, so to speak, would appreciate what you're doing. So after the John Doyle portrait, I continued to enter, and one of the next entries was a Maggie Taylor. And this is just a few of the photographs I shot of Maggie. And I usually do that as a starting point, as a fast-track way of looking at the person, exploring different potential poses, and then hopefully coming up with what I feel is going to be the most effective. I'm sorry about this microphone. So I started out, and you can tell Maggie's very familiar with posing for the camera. She was in her younger years was a model for Helmut Newton. She's an amazing woman. In fact, I painted her just recently in 2020, so 20 years after this painting I did, and just to see the changes, we all changed over 20 years. And I've got to say, she's in the mid-80s now, but she's just as elegant and beautiful as she was here, as she was back when she was being photographed by Helmut Newton. So this is the portrait I painted of Maggie, which was, it's interesting to me in that it doesn't have anything in the background. And all of those elements that I considered, the dog, the trees, the beautiful chair, I just left all of those out because I felt that Maggie had such a strong visual presence that she didn't need anything else in the picture to support her. And it's a little hard to see, in fact you can't see it all here, but if you were looking at the original painting, this is where all the action is. But everything's under wraps. She's got her hair pulled back as she would usually do, her arms folded, and she does it very elegantly, but it's also a defensive posture. So everything, and even the high collar, it's almost a monastic look. Everything is very under wraps, not giving much away. Until you come all the way down here, and she's got bare feet, and in the original painting, the toenails are brightly painted with bright red toenail polish. And I felt like the statement I was trying to make was that this is Maggie, this successful woman who just come out with a tell-all autobiography that just blitzed sold brilliantly. And yet in the autobiography, she was talking about these failed relationships, and so there was both sides of the equation. And I felt like this was a way of representing that sensuality that in many ways she was kind of hiding behind this facade.
What size is it?
It's about life size, so I think it was 84 inches tall. Do you think in inches or centimetres? Measures. So it was about this big. So it was probably a fraction under life size. So the figure here might have been 5.5 feet or something. John Singer Sargent used to say, the ideal portrait is 5/6. I'm not sure where he got that figure from. 5/6 life size. So I'm following in his footsteps, albeit from great distance.
Did that win a prize?
No, but I got a number of commissions based on this painting. And Juliet Ashwood, who was the editor-in-chief of Vogue magazine at the time, Australian Vogue, contacted me for me to paint a portrait of her. And she said, "I like your portrait of Maggie." And I said, "What did you like about it?" And she said, "I liked her long, sexy fingers." I hadn't thought of it in those terms, but that was her take. I continued to enter the Archibald, and after that point I got a reasonably good run, and So most years I would get something, and not every time, but most years. In the year 2000, the art gallery decided to have an adjunct to the Archibald, which they called the Sporting Portrait Prize, because the Olympic Games were in Sydney. So you were required, if you were entering this competition, to paint a sporting person. So everybody I knew, all my artist friends, we all went to the Olympic athletes. They were all too busy training, so we then had to go to people who weren't Olympians. I don't think there were any Olympians in that exhibition, which was kind of ironic. So I painted David Campese, the football player. And if you follow rugby at all, the number 11 was his number. This was another version of the portrait of David that I did at the same time, which is in the National Portrait Gallery. That wasn't in the competition, I did the first one in the Sporting Portrait Prize. So, other people I painted, David Konski, who's now the president of the trustees of the Archibald, who are the judges of the Archibald. At this stage, he wasn't in that position. There might have been a slight conflict of interest there. Frank Lowy. This is Fred Street. Fred Street's one of the life governors of the art gallery. And on the strength of my Ruin HG portrait, which is just around the corner, he got me to paint him and his wife. And this, I thought, sometimes I could talk to students about the process of painting, and people often find that interesting to see how it comes about, what the stages are. So you can see here I've kind of mapped out in a monochrome originally the generalised shape and position of the elements on the canvas, and then I've started to fill them in a bit. This is painted over that underpainting, as you can see, and then I continue on, and this is the result. And Fred had this painting, a wealthy guy, has this painting of by Renoir, genuine Renoir. He told me he travels with his own French passport. Not that it travels much, but so the challenge for me in this portrait, because he was keen to have the Renoir in it, and I was keen to include it as well. But it could have very easily overpowered him, because a pretty young girl or an older man, it's obvious what they're going to look. So if you half close your eyes and look at the screen, you see how this sort of disappears and this jumps out. And as an artist, the way I do that is I compress the total values. I was talking before about total values. So the darkest dark and the lightest light coming closer to a midtone. And that's why not very much within that picture frame there jumps out. And Fred then remains the hero of the composition. There's the finished painting of Fred. This is Pat Corrigan, who I had in the art. Do you know Pat Corrigan? That's he's in the art world. Anyone in the art world knows Pat. He's a lovely guy, very generous, great collector. He's not too well known. He's a lot older, obviously, as we all are. And then this was the portrait I had in last year's Archibald, which is touring at the moment. This is, you can probably tell it's Hugh Jackman and Deborah Lee's wife. And I wanted, when I painted them, to show not so much a portrait of Hugh or a portrait of Deb, but a portrait of their relationship as a couple. They've done so much as a couple with charities and various things over the years. I felt that's what I'm trying to capture. And having that sort of triangular compositional shape, to me felt like it was grounding the composition. And I wanted to give a sense that they're very grounded. And if you were to ever meet these guys, they're so down to earth. They're not pretentious or up in the air. They're very down to earth. So those are the kind of things I was trying to capture. And of course also, what is, it's a theatrical pose, because they are theatrical people, both Deb and Hugh. So, to some extent, yeah. Although this pair was so good at being able to pose, I didn't have to do much. I just was taking photos and doing some drawing when they had a break. But usually, depending on who the subject is, if I'm painting, you know, the head of a principal of the school or the president of the university, oftentimes you'll have to guide them because they're not used to doing it and they feel self-conscious. But these guys, it wasn't such an issue. Although I did kind of suggest maybe just move that foot a bit more. And also I would take elements from different photos and different drawings and combine them. So this doesn't exist as a single image photographically. Do you recognise this guy?
John Doyle, aka Rampaging Royce.
Yes. So this was one of the first entries I put in for the Archibald that didn't get into the Archibald but got into the Salon Refusés. Are you familiar with that Salon Refusés?
Yes, yes.
So, and it did really well for me in that I think it was the People's Choice runner-up, something like that sort. And then from that point on, I was able to get stuck in the Archibald. So when we had the Olympic Games in Sydney in 2000, and I painted this several years earlier, and Roy and H Street had this fantastic broadcast, The Dream, on that program, which I think just blew everybody away. And I thought, if ever we're going to paint this pair as a pair, now's the time. So I went into Triple J and I was broadcasting Fly to Her, and I did some sketching while I was there and did some more at home. That's one of the sketches I did. Just to get a feel for them, their faces, how they interact. And I started by painting, when you've got two people side by side, it's a difficult composition to paint. Because these guys obviously have equal weighting in terms of their prominence in the duo. So if I have one forward, it's going to emphasise that person, or if I have the other one forward, I was conscious of how do I do that in a way that's not misleading in terms of their position. So I started out with, I was recalling when they're on air, normally one would come forward to the camera and ramble on for a while, and the other one would sit back and smile and nod, and then they'd swap over, so they took turns. So I thought, well, that's a motif I can use, that obviously I can't do both because it's a still image. So I started out with John. This painting here is actually cropped down. John's face was up here, and he was in front. Greig was behind. Greig being HG in that pose. And I try as I might, I just couldn't make it work. So I ended up just bringing it aside. And this is a little thumbnail sketch. It's only about this big. And I just thought, you know, I'll try and work with the composition with the pair of them. In this case, I had Greig out front. And what I found when Greig was out front was that it just seemed to work. I don't know why. But he said to me later, that is our experience as well, when I'm out front for some reason. Without a hint of ego, it just seems to work. And then this was the final result. And I added Fatso the wombat, which you'll see when you look at the painting, which was their unofficial mascot. So this painting got the Pickhaver Prize again, and the People's Choice Award. So this is John and Greig posing in front of a painting, trying to mimic the pose for the media when the Pickhaver Prize was announced. And that's the whole group of us, John and Greig, myself, Steve Peters, who's the chief packer, or was back at that stage. This is another portrait I painted for the Archibald was of Donald MacDonald, who was the chairman of the ABC. This is a sketch that I did initially of Donald, and it was the ABC commissioned to do that to give to him ultimately, so I finished it off later. And then the painting I did for the Archibald was actually for the ABC as his kind of official portrait in the ABC headquarters. But they kindly allowed me to enter it. Thank God he got selected to hang, otherwise it would have been really embarrassing. There was a silver portrait. That was in 2010, just after my father had passed away. So it's a very kind of dark, introspective Soul, it was subtitled. So anyway, by this stage, I heard about the Archie 100, which was a competition, an exhibition that would show highlights of the competition's 100-year history. So I was surprised and delighted to get a call from the organisers of the exhibition asking to include my portrait for when I was a student. So with the help of a few friends, I managed to track down where it was. Originally Channel 7 bought it, and they then passed it on to some other people. So I managed to find it out, and they were gracious enough to allow me the archive to borrow it for this exhibition, this tour. In fact, when it started out in Sydney, it was only on for about maybe a month, and then COVID hit, and the whole thing just collapsed. So it was quite disastrous. So it's wonderful that it's now here in Bathurst. When I was attempting to make a living as a portrait painter, for some years, obviously I was being commissioned working in Australia, like I mentioned, the portrait I painted for Julian Ashworth, the Vogue magazine lady. But I wanted to try and expand, I wanted to try and break into the market in America. So what happened is I got a call from a broker, an agent in New York, and who I made contact with a year or so earlier. And the lady said to me, we've got a commission for Columbia University, which is one of the Ivy League universities in New York. They want you, sorry, my throat's going up here. They want you to paint a portrait of their president and chairman, which was just an amazing thing for me. This was going to be my first commission. So this is a photograph of Steve Friedman, who was the chairman of Columbia University. He was also Mr. Wall Street. So the plan was to fly over, spend about 10 days working on the portraits, sketching these guys. Dr. George Ruck was the president, taking reference photos, painting some head and shoulder sketches, studies from life, then return to Australia, do the portraits, and then go back later with finished paintings, and hopefully everybody will be happy. So I flew from Sydney to LA, stayed overnight in Los Angeles. That afternoon, I had an earthquake in LA, about 5 minutes ago. And I've never been in an earthquake in my day. I'm not looking forward to being one again. It was pretty scary. I was on the 10th floor of the hotel that I was staying at, and it was shaking unbelievably, actually. I felt like I was still in the cattle class back of the aircraft, and we were going through turbulence. So I was very happy the next morning to be leaving seismic LA, and flew over to New York, and it was meant to be about a 4.5-hour flight. Ended up being close to 8 hours. And the captain said at one point, I think we have enough fuel to land, but keep your fingers crossed. No, but that's too much information for me. Anyway, we did finally make it. There was just bad weather and congestion at JFK, so we did finally make it, and I felt like I should get down and kiss the tarmac after all these dramas. And I thought I'll put all of that behind me now, focus on this job at hand, and really just try and forget about the drama. So I got up the next morning, got ready for the first appointment. It was about 10 a.m. And I'm watching TV as I'm getting ready, and this plane hits a building. And then another plane hits a building. This was September 11, 2001. So it was a baptism of fire. In fact, looking back on those days and the days that followed, because I was there for 10 days, was surreal. It was like being in a movie. Nothing felt real. All the planes in America, and I think around the world at some point, were grounded. New York was cordoned off. People were worried if food and cash supplies would last. Already talk of anthrax. But there was a tremendous spirit in New York among the people. They were actually friendly to each other, which is unusual for New Yorkers, I'm led to believe. And whenever an emergency vehicle would pass by, people on the street would spontaneously applaud, which it was unlike anything I'd ever seen before. So despite the terrible circumstances, both of these men were able to sit for me. And ultimately the portraits were a great success, but it was a baptism of fire. This is the sketch I painted of Steve Friedman from life, and then did a little bit more work on it later. And this was the painting of Mr. Friedman, framed up. And this oak wall is the one library, which is the main admin centre of Club University. And that's the painting. This one is of David Stern. If any of you have ever followed NBA basketball, David was the CEO or the chairman or no, commissioner of the NBA. That's another picture of David's portrait. So this little statuette is the alma mater statuette. And if you were at Columbia University in this main admin centre, there are stairs at the front. And on the stairs is a giant sculpture. This is the maquette, the study for it. So it was brought down with security guards down to David's office on Fifth Avenue. And we were looking over, this is Fifth Avenue here. Here by State Building, you can't quite see, but it's in the back. So it was quite an iconic thing. And because David's the head of the NBA, I just snuck a little. And I think it's nice to have narrative elements in a portrait just to help tell the story of the person. This guy was a subsequent chairman. In fact, I've done quite a few of the chairman for Columbia. And he was very unwell, so he couldn't sit to me. I didn't even meet him actually, which was a shame. But what he did, his people provided me with photos of him. I chose one that was a decent photo, and he was smiling, which is what he wanted. I don't normally like to do that, but if I'm asked to, I do for commissions. And then I got a friend of mine to pose for the figure, which I then added the head onto, hopefully in a way where it doesn't look disjointed. It looks like it's the guy sitting there. This was another portrait for an American client. He was the president of Indiana State University. And again, the elements I put in there are trying to tell the narrative, the story. And so there's I think it was a style piano. It's a beautiful piano and a piece of art, and I'm not sure why. But they were elements that told the story. At least I was attempting to tell the story. But he was an arts major. That was his thing. Even though he was the president, he was the head of the university. And I don't know whether you noticed this, but you can see the piano's cut away through here. Can you see that? Which is actually wrong. It should be the other way around, because the lower keys are on this side. So, and the shorter keys being, like the strings that the keys hit, being higher are shorter on the high end. So I actually just reversed it because I thought it would be better than painting. I didn't mention this to avoid it. And no one's ever noticed. This was the Dean of the Graduate School at Princeton. I was starting to get some work at Princeton. This is the painting in situ of this guy, John Wilson. And the guy next to him is his successor. So probably 12 years after I painted this, Princeton contacted me and said, Bill Russell, the new guy wants you to paint his portrait now. So this is what I did for Bill. And it was interesting because when I paint a portrait of anybody, I'm conscious of their unique personality and trying to capture something authentic. And one of the things I found out very quickly with Bill Russell was that he was painfully shy, like excruciatingly painfully shy. And I started out by photographing him in all these different moments and poses. And it was just a disaster. And these were all indoor at this stage. And he wore glasses, and I had lights reflecting off the glasses, and it was just a disaster. So I took him outside, and it was actually freezing weather. So the poor guy, I think the poor old after this, he's just wearing his academic robes and just a business shirt and tie. But when I'm heading outside, and this, I don't know if you're familiar with Princeton University, but one of the things it's known for, apart from Einstein and being an Ivy League university, is this beautiful stonework, which is evident in many of the buildings at Princeton. It's really quite beautiful. And this particular building is the official residence of the Dean of the Graduate School. I mean, they do things differently in America. So I painted him standing in front of that. It was symbolic, that made sense. And I got him to look into the middle distance, almost like a visionary kind of a pose. And in that very soft light, even though he was shivering, and there was a puff of wind that bellowed his robes, just enough to give that, that je ne sais quoi. And I thought it felt like it really worked well. And probably you wouldn't get the sense that he was painfully shy. Even in the photo before, he was obviously a younger man. But it's just interesting. And as a painter of portraits, you've got to really get used to that and work with people in there, meet them where they're at. This was a young boy who's painted with his family at upstate New York. This was the president of Wellesley College. One of the things that Wellesley's famous for is Hillary Clinton was an alumni. This was the local portrait in Melbourne. An architectural painter. This was his daughter, who was like a debutante, just started her kind of life, at least her social life. This was a portrait of Brigadier Brian Pizzuti, who was he was involved in the work that the Australian Army did in Papua New Guinea back in this was done back in 2003. So some of these are quite far back. But he had a great profile, Brian. And again, I looked at him in every different perspective, but that, where he was turning his head to the right, just looked so good, and it looked kind of, I know nothing about the army, but it looked like it was a military post. And he told me it was, and the hat and everything else. I just thought, that's a great post. This was another commission for Bond University, and this couple were donors to the university, and so this is hanging in the library at Bond. And again, a couple, there's always that kind of interesting dynamic. How do you represent them? And this guy, the poor man, had macular degeneration, so his eyesight, in fact, when I finally finished the portrait, he was blind, he couldn't see. And he said to me, I've been told that it's going to be like this. It was kind of sad, but his wife obviously could see, and she was Alice, and she was everybody was very happy with it, but it was just a sad story. This is Reg Grundy, who I grew up seeing the name on TV screens at the end of sitcoms and things. And Reg was, one of the things he was very passionate about in the late years of his life was photography, in particular wildlife photography. And so I've got him here as the great white hunter, but with a Canon camera instead of a rifle. I got a commission some years after this, when World Youth Day was in Sydney. The Catholic Church commissioned me to paint this picture of the Madonna and Child from the cathedral. And I used various people. In fact, Jessica, who's my daughter who's sitting here, everybody put your hand up, Jess. Baby Jesus is Jessica. Beautifully model. And just as old as Sister Sophie, this is Sophie's hands. The faces of a girl who Sophie's at school with, so you can see it's an amalgam of, I feel like Dr. Frankenstein sometimes. Putting these body parts together to create something that's hopefully not a monster. That's it from that was the front page of the Sydney Morning Herald, so it was nice to get publicity. Yeah, it was a wattle wreath. The idea was that what they wanted was for it to be very Australian in feel. And when I was working on it, it was at the time of year when there was no wattle or flower. And I was driving up and down, I was coming back from Canberra for some reason. And I noticed one bush on the side of the road, it was a wattle bush, so I grabbed a few sprigs and got home and photographed them before they fell apart. And that was how it came about. And the Southern Cross is this motif. The title of the work that I was given was A Lady of the Southern Cross. So obviously I had the Southern Cross in there. And the rest of the night sky, when I was at uni, I studied science, and my majors were physics and pure maths. So astronomy was one of the things I focused on. So all of the other stars in the sky are in fact in the right positions. And what was an interesting serendipity or providential thing was that right in the middle here where she's standing, Mary's standing, is the South Celestial Pole. So if you were to see the night sky in a time-lapse photo, it would all revolve around that point, which I hadn't planned. So here's the painting installed, me looking a bit kind of shy in front of Pope. While he was in Sydney, I managed to do a charcoal sketch with him. And the picture of Our Lady of Southern Cross opened up a lot of doors for me. Australia Post contacted me to paint a Christmas stamp series. So there's both an Australian version and an international stamp in what they call a miniature back in 2013. So I'm just going to embarrass my daughter again. Just put your hand up again, Jess. Here's Jessie again as the Greig one. And because this was done some years later, this is Jessie again as the Greig. And two of my sons, and then a friend of mine and his kids. In fact, this guy here, the face of the girl who poses Mary is his daughter. So we've got these two sons and Joseph as well. So that was a big family.
Do you get them to all come, like, do you get them to interact with each other? Like, obviously, young Jess and older Jess aren't in the same space, but yeah. your friends that are standing there, do they pose together, or?
Yes, in little groups. So what I would do is I would get a whole series of different configurations and photograph them doing lots of little interactions. And then I would choose which ones work together visually in a kind of interesting composition. So I would have photographed John here. And I got everybody dressed up in went to the costume high school, and we had a lot of fun with that. I might have a picture somewhere of. I've got some food on showing us all dressed up. Well, not me, but everybody else. So that's the way I would do it. And then take lots and lots of photos, probably 400 photos for this, and then choose little elements from within them. And I was using some of the photos I'd originally taken back in the day when Jess was a baby, and reused them, repurposed them for this. This was another version that I was asked to paint for a chapel in Rome. And the original painting was like this big from here up. And I had no idea what she was doing from there now. I just hadn't thought about it with the original painting. So I then had to figure out where she's standing. The river was in the background, kind of representing the spirit. And I had, so I just extrapolated from there. And that's in a chapel in Rome. This was the opening. What happened is they really liked, the Archdiocese really liked what I'd done for the Southern Cross. And they said, the bishop there said, we actually need 32 paintings, and we'd like you to do a 32. And I was kind of gobsmacked. But it was an extraordinary commission to get, and I was very humbled and very grateful. Anyway, this is the opening of Douglas Australia, the kind of big name, or the sea of purple hats or bishops. This is one of the paintings. This is another of mine. And if you were to do a loop around that old chapel, you'd see all 32. Some of them were these small, head and shoulder portraits, but most of them were large, figurative works. That's the one of our ladies at the Southern Cross I showed you just before, where it's actually hanging. This was one of the other paintings. This was a bishop who was in solitary confinement for 15 years. Extraordinary that he survived that. And he's praying, and I guess that's what kept him going. This was Mary McKillop, and I got my niece and nephew to model for me as kids, kind of thing. Street urchins, you might say, that she was working with in Pomona, I believe it was, in South Australia. So I got my niece here, who's now 20-something, a little rag doll. I was trying to make everything look like it would have been back then. And up where I live in Sydney, on the outskirts of Sydney, there's something called Galston, where there's an old sandstone building that would have been about the same age as the one in South Australia. So I photographed the backdrop is of that building. And I also used it again for one of the other paintings I'll show you from interior. This was of St. Patrick and St. Bridget, the Irish patrons. And I thought I'd show you this. This is an interesting, I often show this to artists who are painters who find the process interesting. Here's a photograph of John Henry Newman, and who wrote The Dream of Gerontius, and was quite a famous guy in his day. And he was a cardinal in the Catholic Church. He was late given that honour. So it was a full-length portrait like the ones I just showed you, Patrick and Bridget. And I had to use, well, I didn't have to, but I chose to use that face because I felt it had something about it which I thought would work. And then extrapolate and produce the whole figure. So I got a friend of mine again, because I was doing it for the church, so I had me for me to borrow outfits. And so I dressed a friend of mine up in a cardinal's robes. It was quite a sight to see. And then you can see I've used the face from the reference photo, the old CD photograph, but I've added colour, of course. I've added his skull cap. I've changed the neck. And if you look at the hand, I felt this hand looked a bit awkward, just fingers. And so I repainted the hand in a way that I thought it looked a bit more comfortable and natural. And it's still with the yellow on the table. You know how tall desks, standing desks are in vogue at the moment? John Henry Newman back in the day wrote The Dream of Gerontius and all these other works from a standing desk. So maybe that is the precedent, I'm not sure. And then, again, this is more technical image, but it's just to show when I was working on this design, because I was taking parts from lots of different elements, different pictures that I found, etc. I drew up all these perspective lines so that when I put the table in, when I put this painting in the background, all of the perspective lines would marry up. So there's a lot that goes into these paintings behind the scenes. And that was how it ended up. And standing beside Thomas More. And this is Thomas More in his in the Tower of London, as he's handing over, relinquishing the showing of office as Lord High Chancellor, in order to try and save his head, but didn't work out well for him. And this was taken. Are you familiar with the painting of St. Thomas More in the Frick collection in New York? That was the most famous painting of Thomas More. So I used that. Instead of having his hands here at the front, I expanded them out. And again, just playing around with the composition. This is a photograph that shows part of the dress-up stuff that we did. And you can see these are all different little scenarios, most of which didn't appear in the final picture. This is Jessica. Again, Jessica's. And this is my son Matthew, who's now 22. He was probably about 8. You can see that here. Matt wasn't very happy about posing for his photos. I ended up not using Matt for this. I used it for some other things. Here's another picture. So I set the lights up to try and capture this warm chiaroscuro effect. And in fact, you can see I set up a light at the back with a blue cellular wood, so the backlight is blue. You see that? Quite dramatic so that I could see the difference between the front, the light illuminating from the front, which was ultimately meant to be candle light. So it was going to be golden light. and then the light from the back, which was going to be from a window behind where the daylight was coming in. So I wanted to get those two colours in. That's the Three Musketeers. And this is the painting that I did based on that, and you can see the blue in the background, and then the kind of warm light from the candles in the foreground. Is Jessie here again? And that was the whole painting how I repeated. So, but this is one of the guy I know, the local school teacher, Marty, who's posted here, is this character. That's the final. Oh, this is also my other son, Josh, who's now this tall and studying over Western Australia. Oh, this is John. You know, I showed you the guy in that stamp series. So I feel a bit like Norman Rockwell used to use all his friends and family and local people who posed to him for his paintings. And to some extent, I don't compare myself with Rockwell, but to some extent I'm using a similar approach with these compositions. That's the painting in situ in the chapel in Rome with Lewis Truly. And that's the repeated poem and the painting. You can kind of get a sense of how the whole thing looks. It's quite extraordinary. I'm pinching myself with it. That kind of commission. Excuse me. So this is my studio that I'm building back home on Anchorage. That's gives you a sense of the size of the window. And part of the reason for doing it so large was I thought I'll have workshops. And also, you can't have too much light. And this is a southern light. Do you have any idea why that would be?
It's much softer than.
Why is it softer?
Because it's not direct. Like the sun isn't directly going to cross the window and just give you.
Yeah. So the south is the side that the sun's never on the same side, except at the peak of summer, where the sun rises south of east and sets south of west, which is the troublesome reality. At the equinox, it's even. And I say all that because as a painter, you don't want to have. These are lights from windows I have on the other side, which I can block out. But the main light source you want to have no light coming in because it just spoils the effect. If you're painting someone for life with that light coming in, and if it's moving, then you end up chasing your tail because as the day goes, it's like a sunlight. As the day goes on, the shadows move, and it just doesn't work. So you'll never guess who this little girl is either.
And did you say that was Norfolk?
No, in Sydney. This was a studio I had previously in Kenton, which is not far from Jewel. This is not Jessica. This is Jessie's older sister Sophie, who's now 26. I think she was about 8 or 10 there. But the reason I show you that is I was doing one of the portraits I did, as I showed you before, I think I showed you before, for the sporting portrait prize, because David Campisi. And I started out by drawing it just on the wall, on the white gyprock in charcoal. And when we sold the house, the people who bought it actually cut this wall out to keep the drawing, which I was just about. That's also Sophie when she was about 2.5. And one of the things I was reminded of with Sophie, I was at, this is another picture of her, again around the same age, very cute. And she knew exactly what she wanted, Sophie. Someone said to her, so when you grow up, you're going to be an artist like your dad? And she looked back and she looked at little Scots and she said, no, I am an artist. Which was true. So thank you so much for your attention. I hope you enjoyed it.